Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Brünig, and I'm the Dean and Head of School of the UQ Business School. First and foremost, I acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. On behalf of UQ, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize the valuable contributions to Australian and global society. And because this is a virtual meeting, I always think it's exciting to point out the lands on which we're meeting, even though virtually. And for UQ, this is the St. Lucia campus, where the traditional owners are the Yagara and the Turrbal peoples. Thank you for joining us this afternoon at our Thought Leadership webinar, where we will discuss the future of artificial intelligence and whether machines can learn ethics. I'm pretty confident that there will be lots of questions around these topics, and there is the opportunity to enter these questions into a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And we will use these questions after the talks to go through them. This event speaks to a topic we are passionate about at the business school, which is trust, ethics, and governance. We have recently launched a new multidisciplinary research theme to address this exact topic, to deliver bold ideas to help future-proof businesses in a landscape led by disruption and rapid digital change. We invite you to collaborate with our cutting-edge research to stay a step ahead, solving problems that matter to you, to your customers, and to your stakeholders. Our UQ speaker this afternoon, Associate Professor Sarah Kelly, co-leads this Trust, Ethics and Governance interdisciplinary research theme together with Professor Nicole Gillespie, also at the UQ Business School. This afternoon, we've got two fantastic talks, and I'm now going to introduce the speakers, Sarah Kelly and Noel Williams from KPMG. Sarah is an associate professor in law and marketing and is the director of external engagement at UQ Business School. Sarah is an educational specialist, having won awards for her tertiary teaching, and is globally known for her research and consulting in sports marketing and law, which has influenced national policy and practice. Sarah holds several non-executive directorships, including as Deputy Chair of the Brisbane Lions AFL Football Club, Tourism and Events Queensland, the Gregory Terrace Foundation, and the Wandering Warriors. Noel Williams is a leader in KPMG's technology and cyber practice. Noel works with her clients in the financial services industry to uphold the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of their systems and information. Having started her career at a university, architecting the data warehouse, Noel has retained her passion for all things data and has incorporated data management practices in her 15 years at KPMG and across a breadth of projects, including business reporting, regulatory reporting, and analytics. So we will now hear from Sarah, who will then hand over to Noel. We will then reconvene for questions and answers after Noel's presentation. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Michael, and a very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you very much for your time today in joining us for this really fascinating topic. And I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. In my case, the University of Queensland here, the Yagara and the Turrbal tribes, who probably know best how to gather, connect, and reflect around big issues that affect our society as a whole. And certainly this is one of them. And, you know, something that I think that I'd like to do at the outset, for those of you who may not be fully across what exactly artificial intelligence is, you know, I thought I'd start with just a really brief definition. It's basically not as fancy as it sounds. It's just simulated human intelligence by machine learning and computer systems. That's basically what it is. It obviously manifests in lots of ways, whether it be robots or you know, machine learning or particular weak learning, as they call it, technical tasks, or more fuzzy logic tasks, which we'll talk about a lot today. It involves the sort of similar cognitive skill sets that we use in decision making. Three points to that, and you know, firstly, learning, which involves access to a data set, and manipulation or understanding of that data set, applying rules to it to translate it into something useful, something of value. So that's the first step. The second step is reasoning. We apply reasoning to decision making, and so does machine learning. So choosing which rules to apply to any particular situation to achieve a desired outcome. And these rules are also known as algorithms. And then finally, self-correcting as the machine learns, as we do. You know, there's actually something good about aging, and it's that you're more experienced. You learn from experience, you learn from your mistakes, and so does machine learning. So I think just keep in mind that's how it works. It's similar cognitive skills that are applied to machines and computer systems to decision make and predict from patterns in data sets. And the rapid evolution of AI is extraordinary, as we all know, and I suspect is part of the interest about today's presentation. You know, the volume and the velocity of big data that we now have access to means that the AI can learn very, very fast, very efficiently, and actually make very objective and reliable decisions, even more accurate decisions than humans do. And in fact, if there's two takeaways I want you to take away from this presentation today, the first one, first and foremost, is that machine learning, AI, is actually, the worst AI is probably a lot better, a lot more accurate than the best human decision making. So human decision making, we have to remember, is also and can be very, very flawed all the time. So I think that was the first point I wanted to make. The second one is that as a business leader, in whatever sector you're in whatever occupation you're in, and even as a citizen and as a consumer, it's really important to understand this topic deeply, to engage with it, to engage with sandpit discussion around it, because ethics and AI really needs multiple disciplines, multiple leadership applied to it to solve this very real global problem, which is actually being hailed by the experts and researchers in the field as one of the greatest problems we will need, policy problems and citizen problems we will need to solve over the next 10 years. So they're the two takeaways I really wanted you to look at today. So let's look at, I'll just share my screen. So firstly, I think the point is that AI is actually really efficient in decision making. And as I said, can be much more accurate in decision making than humans. You know, it can keep us safe, for instance. It assists scientists, as we've seen with the pandemic this year, share big data across the world in resolving how the virus travels, how to develop a vaccine around it. This is, you know, AI has been very informative in that space. It helps us understand environmental changes related to climate change, for instance, in mapping out our reefs and oceans through the use of drones, for instance. There's smart cars, there's decisions made around access to credit, for instance, applications into universities, exam results, employment, hiring and firing decisions. So many decisions are now made by AI. Surveillance, of course, is another one increasingly used by governments to keep us safe and healthy, as we've seen with the COVID tracing app more recently. It also offers a lot of convenience and customization in our lives, as many of us, I don't know about you all, but I've certainly subscribed pretty heavily to the Netflix offering. It's a great model, and of course it's modeled on AI. For those of you who follow sport, as I do, we're seeing increasingly AI referees coming in to second guess human referees. So again, it's becoming a bit of a spectacle, but also a very useful method in terms of accuracy and objectivity and decision making. And it's interesting that it does actually add value, AI, and we're seeing it in the stock market. In times like now where we're seeing such a volatile stock market, it's called the FANGs plus the M, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, and Microsoft, outperforming most stocks in growth and performance for that matter. The reason is they are underpinned as a business model by AI, and there's many, many other examples. So what's happening increasingly with this rapid evolution of AI and the influence it is having in all of our workplaces, all of our organizations, and all of our lives, is that it's increasingly arbitrating fairness for us. And, I'm sure when I mention the word fairness, we all, even from children, from childhood, you have an innate feel about justice, about what's fair and what isn't. But it's a grey area, isn't it? Imagine if you had to reduce your perception of fairness into something that is quantitative and able to be measured and able to be programmed into an algorithm or a rule that machine learning then adopts in decision making. It's a really fuzzy concept. And so this is where AI and ethics collide increasingly. That concept of fairness, because fairness is increasingly being decided by computer programmers. They are arbitrating for us what is fair as it is inputted into the relevant algorithms. So, the problem is ethically, who decides, who should decide, and how should it be decided, these fuzzy concepts that come into any kind of decision making, including the simulated kind in AI. So I thought I'd just run through a quick, for those of you who've studied philosophy, forgive me, but this is a very common story or analogy, which I think is very useful when we're discussing this topic. And it's the trolley problem. And the trolley problem says, imagine a scenario, basically, when you're at the top of a hill, you've got a lever next to you, and that lever can control the railway tracks for where the trolley goes. The track that the trolley is headed down towards has 5 people unable to escape that track. They are tied to that track. They will die, certainly. In the other scenario, if you were actually able to pull the lever, if you decided to pull the lever, it can be diverted. It can save the 5 people, but it will surely kill a person who is currently crossing the track that you can see. What do you do? What do you decide in that moral and ethical situation? The weight of research since about 2001 has said in moral psychology that 90% of people would choose to pull the lever to save the 5 and sacrifice the 1. But what if you make this question a little grayer, a little fuzzier, and you say, well, what if that person, the one person, was your spouse? What if the one person was your child? What would the decision be then? And this is where it becomes analogous to automated smart cars and AI in the autonomous car industry. So autonomous cars, when we think about it there, the same scenario could happen where you are driving your autonomous car, which is programmed by an algorithm that is designed to minimize fatalities, say. And you're heading towards 5 people who are out in the middle of the road, and you're unable to stop, and you will surely kill them unless you divert into a wall and kill yourself and the occupants of your car. What do you decide then? You can't decide. You're in an autonomous car. But the car, pre-programmed around minimization of life loss, will divert you into that wall. And that's all very well and good when we discuss it as a hypothetical. But when it comes to programming these cars and owning these cars, who should decide on these ethical dilemmas? Should it be the car owner? And would you actually buy a car that is pre-programmed to head you and your family into that wall? So this is the question. Or should it be the private company that owns the smart cars that decides how the car should be programmed in these grey, fuzzy areas of decision-making that humans are fairly good at? So this is the problem. Or should it even be governments or independent agencies who have access to the algorithms who can make those decisions as well with an overriding regulatory scheme of some sort? So I think you'll see that it is clearly, an area of discussion and a topic that has high stakes. So one way of looking at these ethical problems is using universal governance principles that are well established and overlaying that into the AI field. And what we see there in the current evolution of AI, at least, is that 3 universal governance principles and ethics principles are breached. Firstly, transparency. The understanding of when AI is being used, how it's being used, how it impacts us, and the underlying rules or algorithms that are being applied and the principles being applied to the AI decision-making process. Secondly, accountability. you know, who is in charge of or who is responsible for the decisions that emanate from the AI systems, and even the unintended or indirect consequences of those decisions and prediction. And we've seen, you know, it's becoming very real when we see Facebook and the US Congress inquiry recently around that very issue. And it is still not settled. We still don't know who should be accountable. Should it be the computer programmers who program the algorithms? Should it be the companies that rest their very business model on these algorithms? It is subject to debate. It is not even close to settled legally or in governance, but it's something that we all need to be across. And finally, the data bias that can, as it does occur in human decision-making, can also occur in the AI decision-making as well. So just looking at that, I've mentioned, you know, Facebook and many platforms, I should say, all have this as their business model, that the algorithms can actually cause some harm in some cases, but are also incredibly convenient and efficient for many industries, which rest on these platforms like Amazon and Facebook. So they're great for the economy in many ways. But in others, of course, we found there was an inquiry out of the UK just recently, which and Germany as well, which have declared that some of these platforms and their algorithms are in fact dangerous. They are resulting in polarization and echo chambers of viewpoints. They are also resulting in some addictions to screen and social media behaviors, for instance, and other issues as well, other hazards. So this is where we have to really examine it a little bit more closely. The same with the increasing use of surveillance, for instance. We know that governments around the world are using it for our safety and our health, as I mentioned earlier. And the machine learning around vision and facial recognition, for instance, is rapidly improving, as it has, we've seen with voice, for instance. So this is another area where we need to understand when and how it's being used, how it's being stored, and decision-making that may affect us all as citizens is being made. And the key, of course, is around things like transparency and making those algorithms readily available, for instance, or able to be scrutinized by the public. Some of the stakes too, as I mentioned in this decision, these outcomes are really high in things like the objectivity or the bias that is needed as a universal governance principle in ethics. And, you know, one that comes to mind is around recidivism in the US and the use of AI platforms or tools by judges to decide the likelihood or the risk of a particular offender reoffending. And that's been really interesting because some of the platforms have been subject to public scrutiny, and the algorithms made available for an independent agency of some kind or a researcher to scrutinize that platform around potential for revealing bias, even though of course that was unintended. But the unintended bias is what has been found in many, many studies and research around decisions of who stays and who is released from prison. So that was revealed to have some, unfortunately, racial outcomes in the results. But of course, we have to compare that to a judge. And of course, judges can be just as biased. We're seeing racism. It's a very topical issue, obviously, at the moment. But we see that in human decision-making. But the difference is that a judge is subject to scrutiny. A judge, the rationale used by that judge is subject to scrutiny. There is a right of appeal. The defendant sees that rationale and has that right of appeal. Very, very different from an algorithm that has been used. One of them is Compass, owned by North Point in the United States, where its algorithm was owned by that company and held as a trade secret, as they often are, and so therefore not transparent, not able to be scrutinized, and was found to reveal a racial bias in the decision making. So high stakes, as I said, and something to think about. Recruitment, I know Noel, I think, will mention this example in more detail, but this is quite a well-known one about Amazon finding that its recruitment platform, an AI platform, revealed that the words used to recruit executives and senior leadership talent were actually biased in terms of gender. And again, unintentionally, but when they actually audited the algorithm and the process in the training data, as well as the learning process and reasoning process of the AI, it was revealed that in fact it did come out as a biased kind of result. Of course, many of us are wearing the health monitors at the moment, another form of AI that affects us all. And of course, there's a happy story there. It's keeping us motivated and healthy. But on the other hand, how is this data being used? What are the algorithms exactly? And how are they predicting things like potential health insurance, access to health insurance? In sport, it's used as well in terms of predicting high performance, reducing injury or injury prevention. And, one step on from that is, well, player and athlete valuation and sport valuation. Many ethical issues there about that sort of data and the decision-making that can be used around it. So I think it sort of, when it boils down, it's important to understand all these different ways AI is used, even in our homes now, as you can see there. What degree of control are you prepared to give up as a citizen? So it's really important to engage, I think, with this issue as a citizen more than anything, to understand that gradually, AI, as it evolves, is helping us, but at the same time, we're giving up something. And yes, it has been traditionally privacy to an extent, and many of us are prepared to give that up for the convenience and the efficiency that AI and even the accuracy that it can offer. But on the other hand, we have to start thinking about fairness and ethics. So, when we go back to that big question, how do we measure and how do we quantify fairness? There's so many things we need to consider. Things like, does it affect different groups or subgroups of society differently? And of course, some of those examples I've just cited are very good examples of how it can. How do we input social, political, cultural nuance in these decisions? Very, very tricky. What sort of fairness proxies, in other words, can we use where the trade-off in bias in the ultimate decision-making and prediction is kept to a minimum or mitigated, in other words? So every decision, every notion of bias will inherently have a trade-off in a level of bias, but we have to decide which level we will accept. So I just thought I'd throw that up to show you how the weight of research and concern is increasing around fairness in published papers in the last few years. And that's, increasing even more over the last couple of years. Very, very interesting to see. And now we're seeing regulation very concerned in this space. And I'm sure many of you will have read about some of the moves. One coming out of the UK has been what is called, they're advocating for the invocation of a windfall clause, where AI-based companies making windfall profits out of AI systems are required by law to donate a portion of those profits back to ensuring adequate governance in that industry, as well as other industries. So that's on the table at the moment, but there are other pieces of legislation, like there's the Algorithmic Accountability Act that is being suggested by the Federal Trade Commission in the US, enabling it to access some of these algorithms or rules that the AI uses. Another suggestion, which is gaining a lot of traction, is enabling traditional anti-discrimination acts to actually include AI decision-making processes and compulsory algorithmic audit from the initial training data stage to the ongoing evolutionary stage as the system is self-correcting, right through to the bias inherent potentially in the decision-making, and tested counterfactually in different groups to check that they're all equally affected by any error rate that comes across. So I'll just wind up there before I introduce Noel with just a few takeaway tips that I'm hoping you can even implement tomorrow in your lives, in your thinking, in your workplaces. Things like understanding that, where AI can correct bias and when humans can actually scrutinize and correct AI. I think it's really important to understand the increasing relationship and the ethical nuance between humans and AI interaction. Look at employing an algorithmic ethicist. It's so important that this problem be looked at from many perspectives. Why isn't it that the algorithms are not being examined so closely, and this whole AI process of learning examined by lawyers, by CEOs, by consumers, by citizens, by social scientists and ethicists as well? So I think it's really important to ensure you're employing people in this area, even rewarding the computer programs who are at the coalface of this. They get rewarded, as I understand it. I'm not an AI expert, but I understand they get rewarded for picking out bugs in systems in the AI. Why not get rewarded for picking out ethical breaches and biases in the AI? I think that's really important that we look at it that way. Promoting diversification, as I said, in this field is so important. Reflecting and engaging in the discussion, learning constantly about this fast moving field and where it's at and how it affects not only your workplace and your work sector even, but you as a citizen, your family as well. It's really important we understand what's going on here and, appreciate what it can do for us, as well as, maybe some of the dark side and having an ethical and moral regulatory lens to an extent as well. So thank you so much for being here and listening. I hope that there's been something of value for you to reflect on and take away. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Noel Williams, partner at KPMG, to continue with this discussion. And we look forward to hearing your questions come through. Thank you.
Hello, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for that kind introduction, Michael and Sarah both. And Sarah, also thank you very much for that presentation. That was fascinating. I really enjoyed that. And it sets a lot of definitions, I think, nicely as well. So let me just share my screen with everyone. Make sure my tech's working. There we go. Okay, so ethical considerations in the advancement of AI. And, but defining from my side as well, when I talk about AI, I'm talking about AI in the broad sense and including machine learning and deep learning and neural networks as a subset of that. I know there's different schools of thought out there. There isn't one overarching definition of what exactly AI entails and whether machine learning is actually separate from AI or not. For the purposes of today, when I'm talking about AI, I'm actually talking primarily about machine learning. And by my definition, it is a subset of artificial intelligence in and of itself. And it is actually one of the most researched and heavily used components of AI today. So when we think about the advancement of artificial intelligence and how do we measure the advancement and what contributes to that, there's three main areas that researchers talk about, and all of these areas have ethical considerations. So firstly is the data itself. Is the data of sufficient volume, quality, availability to even train your models and or run your models on? Secondly, are the algorithms actually innovating in and of themselves? Are we finding new and novel ways to actually perform the computations to come out with answers and to get to answers? And finally, what is the amount of compute power that we actually even have to run these models on? Because you can write a beautiful algorithm and have a plan to put that into practice, but if you don't actually have enough computers and power and grunt to run that, then you can't actually put that into practice. And often when we think about ethics and AI, the discussion focuses primarily on the algorithms themselves, the concern that they oftentimes are black boxes, that more and more as we get into deep learning and neural networks, that these black boxes are starting to find their own ways of pattern matching, pattern recognition, and that they're actually not intended for us to necessarily be providing every step of the way or to be able to necessarily unpick and understand how they got to the answers they got to. And that is actually part of the advancement in the algorithm, but that's also part of what makes people very nervous, because how do you check what the machine is doing and how do you check what the machine is basing its decisions on? And so as much as there is focus on that, what I actually want to talk about today is the other two contributing factors to AI advancement. And that is firstly in data, that there's the training data that is required carries so much bias and different forms of bias. Sarah spoke about quite a few of them. I'll talk about a couple of examples that are actually slightly different takes on the bias that sits in the data sets that we have today available for training. And secondly, on that amount of compute power. So what should we be thinking about in terms of resource consumption, and just what does that carbon footprint look like of the training and the model runs that we're doing today, and what is the cost of that? So firstly, let's talk about the data. Old adage holds true: garbage in, garbage out. And when I talk about bias in data, often I think, you know, the people I work with today and my clients and industry all seem to be quite well aware of the fact that using historical data sets often carry a high level of inherent bias. Sarah, you mentioned that wonderful example of Amazon and their hiring algorithms and how that carried such a strong preference bias of men hiring men, and because they use their own historical data for that. So oftentimes when organizations have their own set of historical data to work off of, it's unfortunately carrying a lot of historical biases that are gender or racial in nature, and that's not something that you necessarily want to carry forward. I think awareness of that is becoming far better, and there is a lot more work and effort going into today looking at unbiasing the data sets. Another area that data holds AI development back in is around quality. And just the quality of the data that an organization holds. So often in their historical data, they unfortunately weren't collecting it with sufficient quality and diligence over time that they're even able to use those data sets necessarily to train on. And so in the two examples I'm going to cover now, you actually have very high quality data, very high volume data, and it's very recent data, and yet it still manages to be garbage data. And so I'll talk through those now. The first one is Microsoft and their Tay AI bot. So Microsoft released an AI bot that was intended to chat. They put it out in the world on Twitter, and they, you know, said, if the more you talk to me, the smarter I get. And they wanted to see how Tay would evolve and develop a personality and, you know, start developing preferences for certain groups or music or literature. And unfortunately, Twitter trolls took over, and Tay very quickly, within a matter of, I think it was about 24 hours, started tweeting out some incredibly offensive statements. Some were simply because she had a she, it wasn't a male or female. There you go, there's a bit of bias there. Because the machine had a repeat after me function. But beyond that, it actually started learning that to say things that were incredibly offensive, and that just hadn't been catered for sufficiently by Microsoft in the way that they had built the algorithms. And you know, the intent was quite novel, and the intent was good. It was to see what this machine would do through conversation. It was to advance natural language processing capabilities. But unfortunately, when you start getting trolls putting information into the system, it starts to take on those characteristics, and it starts to parrot that back, because at the end of the day, it's an algorithm, it's a machine, and it's going to represent the data that comes into it, and it's going to mirror that back out to the world. The next example is the AI song contest from Eurovision. So this year, there was an organization, I think it was a Dutch organization, that put out there that said, please submit us your AI generated songs, and we'll run an AI song contest alongside the Eurovision Song Contest. And so several of these were trained on Eurovision previous winners, such as, you know, ABBA and great music like that, for lyrics and for melodies. And I think if you just look at the titles of those songs, they're in the top 10 winners. You know, you can see where some of those came up with some very interesting names, such as I Keep Counting, I Write a Song, like the Painful Words one by New Piano as well. But if we look at, in particular, the winner, which by the way was Australian, so many of you might have seen some articles about this. It got a lot of press here because the winner was Australian. Uncanny Valley with the song called Beautiful the World. And it had these lovely lyrics of dreams still live on the wings of happiness. And some of the lyrics weren't entirely sensical, but actually if you look at music over time, oftentimes lyrics aren't particularly sensical in songs. It is art and it is poetry. And the melodies for this song, fascinating, they used kookaburra and koala calls and use that as a synth in the background. And they also use Eurovision song lyrics. And that's where I think you get those really romantic, the dreams to live on the wings of happiness lyrics. As a comparison, the third place song, which placed relatively high, I think, based on what this song was about, was trained on Reddit. And if anyone spent too much time on Reddit or gone too far down into the subreddits, again, there's quite a lot of troll type activity there, quite a lot of abusive language that comes through, a lot of anarchy and anarchist song there, apparently, because the lyrics that it crescendoed into on the song A Bus was "Kill the government, kill the system." And what was interesting was that this group actually submitted the song as it was, and they said, look, this is a reflection of our society. This is a reflection of what is on Reddit, and the machine is simply representing that into a song format. And here it is, world, you need to deal with this, because this is what you're putting out there into the world. This is the data that you're creating, and this is what's available to us. So if we think about the data problem, there's a few different ways we can tackle that. You know, first is, I think, and something that I'm a big proponent of, is that you really need to start looking at your data yourself in your organizations and your institutions. What are we collecting? Are we treating it with sufficient care? Are we treating it as an actual asset? Are we collecting enough data? Are we putting enough quality metrics over it? Are we managing it in a way that we actually can use it for potential future use cases that we haven't necessarily imagined for today? And so there's, you know, lots of different frameworks out there for data governance and management. This one is one that I employ quite often, and it's got 11 different layers. Apologies if you can hear the background noise. I've got two little ones in the house. But it covers everything from the strategy and that forward thinking about what your uses are for data now and in the future, right through to those operational layers around how do you manage it practically today, so that you do have it for your current use cases and also the future. Second is to think about the ethics through the life cycle of your data. So it's not just what do I do with it in terms of my analytics and my AI applications, but it's also what data do I capture? What data do I retain and store? What data do I monetize? What data do I share? There's ethical considerations all throughout that life cycle of that piece of data once it comes into your organization. And so if you do, you know, start going down the path of data governance and management, you really need to think about the ethics every step of the way. And finally, think about your use case. So the use cases that work best today that I've seen in practice are the ones that are about things, not people. They're the ones that have a clear right and wrong answer. So you don't have that gray area, you don't have the subjectivity, you're not trying to replicate subjectivity through a machine. The machine knows whether it's gotten it right or wrong. And finally, it's got a human in the loop. So again, this isn't the utopia. You're not able to hand it all over to the machine and the machine is able to just start making accurate decisions day after day after day. You still need a human there to check and to make sure that the answers that are coming out are correct. But that's how you can reinforcement train, and reinforcement training with supervised learning is a very common practice today, through to really good outcomes. And the area that I've seen this done across a couple of different industries, but it's the same use case, is where they're receiving paper-based forms. And those forms get filled in, maybe the same information, but slightly different positioning on the form, depending on who they're getting it from. And that they can train the machines to firstly scan it in and do the, you know, text reading, the OCR, and then to look for the patterns for what the piece of data is that you're trying to find to actually input into the system. And with that human in the loop to check these things as it goes through, these machine learning algorithms are extremely efficient at being able to quickly then take what was a very manual process and turn it into an automated process as soon as it comes through the door. And it's actually a great way to bridge communities where they aren't particularly computer literate, may not have access to systems, may not have access to apps, are still working off paper-based systems, but then you can quickly digitize that going forward. So this next example is sort of bridging between, it's an excellent example of where the data was well structured. It was clear whether there was a right or wrong outcome. You actually have perfect information because it is a game. and you know whether you've won or lost. And it's an excellent example of algorithmic innovation, but it will actually take me into my point about resource consumption, the considerations we need to have there. So this is AlphaGo versus AlphaGo Zero. AlphaGo is a algorithm that was designed to play the game Go. And the game Go, whilst it's black and white pieces on a board, so it's quite simple in terms of rule sets. However, is such a size of the board and so many different pieces that all possible outcomes can't be calculated by a system. So even though you do have perfect information available to you, your compute power is just not there. You can't predict every possible outcome after every move by your opponent to then decide what the next best move is. So the algorithmic innovation that was achieved here was fantastic, because what they were able to do was to work off of imperfect information, but to actually beat a human. And I believe it was 2016, yes. So in 2016, AlphaGo was released, and it beat the world's best Go player. A year later, DeepMind released AlphaGo Zero, and AlphaGo Zero played AlphaGo, so machine on machine, and 100 times to zero beat the previous version of the algorithm. And so that innovation was amazing, to achieve that within a year, but secondly, that it took 8 times less compute power to do AlphaGo Zero than it did to do AlphaGo. So you were achieving really good efficiencies in terms of the space of just only 12 months. So better outcomes, more efficient. That said, the carbon footprint of AlphaGo Zero was estimated to be at the level of 23 Americans' homes for an entire year, just to train that one algorithm to play a game. And so you have to ask yourself, is that worth it? Is it worth that level of carbon footprint to achieve that outcome? And most would argue, who are in the field, that yes, it was, because the algorithmic innovation that was achieved there with reinforcement learning and the ability to do it on imperfect information is actually phenomenal and can be applied, in several different use cases. But still, it's something to think about, and it's something to think about whenever you're developing any algorithm in your organization, is to think about how much am I actually going to use in terms of resources? How much compute power is this going to take up? Now, good news is algorithms are getting more efficient. And what this graph is showing here, and just focus on sort of that middle bar and the top bar, that 8 times growth is Moore's original law. So Moore's law says that every 2 years, we're going to have a doubling in terms of computer processing power. And that's how we get from the mainframes that are the size of small cars to the smartphones that we have today in our pocket, right? So that's Moore's law in action, is giving us more computing power and a more efficient and smaller footprint. Moore's law supports obviously AI in that space as well, because that's your increase in compute power over time. But our algorithms are actually outpacing in terms of the computing resources that they are requiring. And that's how we get to those huge amounts of carbon footprint that those are taking up. But the researchers here have actually identified, based on publicly available sets of algorithms and their ability to estimate runtimes and CPU usage, et cetera, that the efficiency of those algorithms is actually outpacing Moore's law as well. So between the two of those, you've actually got a multiplicative effect, that you are getting more efficiency out of your algorithms quicker than you are getting increases in compute power. And so the hope is that both of those will start to narrow, and therefore, maybe we're at peak compute usage today. And certainly something that we're starting to see a trend in research papers is that they're starting to publish what their actual carbon usage was at the top, and that they're actually purchasing carbon offset for that. So making that part of your research that's published in terms of how efficient is my algorithm. So just in closing, all 3 of these areas are important to the advancement in AI, and all 3 of these come with their own considerations around ethics and what we need to be considering as we are developing AI applications going forward. The key takeaways, I suppose, that I would emphasize are addressing the data debt. I I'm a strong believer that you should start creating your own data, that everyone should be collecting the data in their organizations to the best of their abilities, treating it as an asset, keeping it of sufficient quality as well as quantity, that it is there and it's available for you to use in everything from business intelligence reporting through analytics and to AI and machine learning applications. Your own data is going to be the most representative of the use cases that you're going to want to create. Also, that for now, apply AI to things, not to people. So when the machines are making decisions about things, it's much easier to have unbiased data. It's much easier to know whether the answer is right or wrong. And you're not having that subjectivity, and you're not trying to unpick the way that a human brain makes decisions based on another human. Consider the cost benefit. So think about the resource requirements if you are going to run some AI. And I think as institutions and as governments, we also need to think about what the leading research institutions and the leading private companies are doing in terms of, what is Google, what is Facebook, what is Amazon doing in terms of how much power are they using to achieve their algorithms that are designed to sell you things. And that's a big question that hasn't necessarily been tackled yet through policy. But if we think about energy policy, the continuing use of compute power is certainly something that we need to consider going forward as a society. And finally, when in doubt, leverage the leaders. So if your use cases aren't ones that you can use your own data, if your use cases are based on marketing, and there are other organizations out there that do that better and already do that today, right off the back of that, use the Google ads, use the Facebook ads. So marketing is a great example where that's already being done in industries today. It's being done very well. They'll be doing it to the most efficient and highest quality possible. When it comes to things about subjective decision making that from your organization is actually going to impact your customers or your constituents or your stakeholders, that's when you need to think about bringing it in-house and having your own control over what the ethical outcomes and use of that are. So that's all I wanted to cover today. I look forward to the questions. Thank you all very much. Thank you for your time.
So thank you very much, Sarah and Noel, two absolutely fascinating talks, and clearly starting a bit of a discussion already on our Q&A, and people have been commenting there and been asking are the slides actually available and things like that. I'll leave that the professional team to answer. I want to open the Q&A session with a question for Sarah, probably. I mean, normally this is the point where we would all clap and thank you for your great talks, and somehow this is missing in the virtual environment. So, but please just imagine that this is currently happening. So let me kick off Q&A, and let me start with Sarah, and then go into one of the questions that came very early on in Sarah's talk. So my question is, because you laid out this ethics dilemma there really nicely, and I think it was really interesting how you developed these scenarios. There's this human side to accepting a decision that has been made. And what I mean with that, we have become somewhat tolerant to human failure. So we're accepting that humans make the wrong decisions, and in a way, even though we don't like it, I think we've got used to accepting those sometimes very fatal errors that humans are making. But I think I think it's predictable that it's a lot harder to accept the wrong or presumably wrong decision of a machine. Maybe I would be interested in your comments on this question.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, actually, Michael. Thank you for that. I think it's the weight of the research at the moment on human AI computer interaction says that robots, at least, in a sort of, most of them are well trusted. They're more trusted than humans because of their neutrality, which I think is a really interesting finding from that research in robotics. But, when you're looking at something that's more latent, like the smart car decision-making algorithms, like the hire and fire decisions, like the recidivism decisions that I talked about reoffending, that's where it gets a little grey. And I would suggest that a lot more research is needed in the first place around what is the wisdom of crowds on this and their perceptions of what is fair and ethical in that decision-making process, which is really what I guess both Noel and I have discussed around the entire process, and really getting access, getting transparency. It comes back to those universal ethical and governance principles. Show us the algorithms, let an independent auditor look at them or a researcher look at them, freely available. And, you know, I think that's a really important point moving forward as we're seeing more and more sophistication in the AI and evolution of it in a latent way. Surveillance is another area as well we should all be looking at very closely. So I hope that helps answer it in a short answer. I think this is a sandpit discussion that we all need to have for days on end.
Yeah, I think we're only just starting with this discussion, and it probably leads very well into a question that was asked by our colleague Marek. He's asking, should machines learn ethics? And should we rather be focusing on the ethical, essentially making sure that the ethical decisions are always made by humans and putting the controls in place to do that? And I would love to have a really quick answer from probably both of you on this one question, maybe starting with you, Sarah.
Yeah, I do. I think machines, I think AI is already sophisticated enough when we talk about what they call strong AI and the fuzzy logic that it is now learning. We can absolutely program it around these concepts, fuzzy concepts in it that are ethical dilemmas essentially, and the grey areas that humans are very intuitive, very nuanced on. The only trouble is we have to look at training the programmers, and with that diversity of perspective, the cultural, political, social, multi-layered perspective that ethics is. So in that training, it has to be a lot more diverse, I would argue. And secondly, second guessed by these independent algorithmic auditors.
Yeah. Noel, what are your thoughts on this question?
Well, you know, it's a big question. It's a good question. I would echo Sarah that it is a lot about looking at the inputs. So, you know, who is defining the algorithms, who is defining what is the right outcome versus the wrong, and what's going to reinforce the machine learning and or the AI in terms of what it's going to be rewarded for versus penalized for. And then also looking at the data that goes into it, and is that data actually going to give us the types of decision making that we would want it to make. You know, I think the recidivism one is a good example where you can see there's quite a bit of bias if you just do based on the numbers of, you know, who's in prison today versus who isn't, and the type of sentences that are given, and therefore is that historical data even useful? And so looking for new and novel data sources that are better informers of the outcomes, which will then depend on the machines being able to look more deeply into the data and in more complex ways to find the patterns that we as humans can't find. But ultimately, you have to have that human in the loop, and you can't just trust the machine to make decisions on its own. You know, I think we've all seen Terminator and The Matrix, and even Space Odyssey 2000, right? So we all know what happens if you just tell the machine to be as efficient as possible. So it's about what are you training that for? What are your objectives, and what are the targets that you're setting? And that is where it is harder when it's not a clear-cut yes and no answer. And I actually don't know that today we're ready to roll that out in a large scale. You know, I think that's sort of still for research to be working on. And working on those ways to, as I said, find those new and novel data sets that don't come with the bias already built in.
Okay, thank you for that. And it leads very nicely into the question of data at the basis of well, decision making. And you had a very nice diagram where you were talking about the data ethics life cycle. And I was intrigued by that in the sense that very often companies, organizations don't have that full control over the data, actually optimizing decision-making based on data that they actually don't own and that don't have control over, even though they would like to. So how does that influence this perspective as a data ethics life cycle?
In terms of how organizations manage their data, it's an incredibly, hot topic at the moment because of the use of third parties in so many ways. And, primarily, I think the most obvious one is that all of our data sits either on Amazon, Google, or Microsoft platforms because they're the big cloud providers, right? So there's very few organizations that actually hold any of that stuff in-house these days. And so whilst they may have control over it from a usage perspective, and there's security controls around it, at the end of the day it is sitting on these platforms that are these very large organizations. And so you just have to have a level of stringency around what you put in terms of checks and balances to make sure that your data is protected. There's quite a bit there that sits in the information security world just as a baseline of practice, just to be able to make sure that your information is protected. But then it starts moving into the what do I do with that data. And so if I'm sharing my data with a third party to start doing some marketing analytics per se, how do I know that they're not going to use my information in a way that's not intended? And there's also a lot of questions in the privacy field right now, because generally speaking, if I've given my information to an organization, I've given them consent to use it. That consent is not particularly well documented or recorded today. It's a bit of a fuzzy handover where, because I've given it to you in the course of business, it is now your data. And as a consumer, I think we're going to see further and further advancements into having really clear-cut consent around your own information and what you've done with it. And organizations themselves will then have very strong consent management that sits off the back of that around what their customers and stakeholders have given consent for, as well as what they give consent to be done. I'm in financial services, so we have the consumer data right that's coming into play come July. So the banks will start doing open banking and start sharing consumers' data. That comes with a very clear and explicit set of consent around it. And that's just a fascinating path. I won't go down into the weeds in that too much, but you can see how as a society we are moving further and further into sharing our information. And as Sarah rightly said, we like to share our information to get the convenience for it, but we also do want to know what that information is being used for. And at some point, what information are we willing to let go of and we aren't going to worry about, versus what information do we want to protect, which might be things like our health and our banking and financial history.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you for that. Sarah, a lot of the people who were listening were really interested and intrigued about the bias topic and the decision-making, with the hope of a bias-free decision-making system, and a bit of the worry that to what extent is that actually possible. And one interesting question that came up, and in the context of hiring, how does a system actually, how does a system react, or how would we avoid a system reacting in a bad way? If, for example, a person does not have an online profile at all and the system can't learn anything about that person, and there might be good reasons for a person not being able to create an online profile.
Yeah, look, I think the first point is no decision-making or prediction system is 100% unflawed. So whether you're a human or you're an AI, there is none in that situation when you're actually deciding to allocate resources, for instance, or access of some sort. So I think that's the first point to make. So it comes down to that trade-off between deciding what's a level of fairness that we are happy with, that will reveal, a small error rate in the population with which we're concerned. So I think that's sort of where it's at. So the idea is mitigating that bias, obviously, by testing out different fairness principles in the scenario. And so one solution is, I guess, avoiding use of historical data and creating value in the AI by going from what Noel was just mentioning and creating your own data set from scratch and evolving it very, very quickly. Tesla's been very good at that, for instance. The cars have learnt very quickly from all the Tesla owners in the world as they've actively been driving. So they haven't used historical data so much, but they're using real data in real time as their own. The same with all the FANGs I talked about, the high-performing stocks earlier. Netflix, the same sort of model, very successful because they have developed their own data set to train the AI from. So I think that's one method. But another one in terms of mitigating that bias that is inherent in most of the decision making is to use things like some of the the stuff's coming out in the research that is working, is this counterfactual sampling, where you run the decisions and the data at any point in the learning process against a subsample that is completely different to the sample for which you're sampling, to ensure that the error rates are the same, the bias is the same and affects each of those subsample groups in the same way. So it's fair, everyone is equally affected by the bias, in other words. And that is where some of those examples I gave earlier have failed. And so I think that's a really important process to look at, that counterfactual testing.
Okay, I think this is extremely relevant. I'm going to give one last question. I mean, there's more questions that we can go through, but this is the last one that I'm going to throw out there. And I think it's a very interesting one, because where can we draw the line between, or how can we ensure that where we are trying to be ethical, or a system being ethical and fair, that this is not resulting in censorship and we're actually handing over control to a certain group of people? And you're both nodding, so maybe have a short, sharp comment on this, and then we're going to close it here.
Noel, you go first.
Yeah, it's I mean, that's the crux of it all, is no human is without bias, no system is without bias. You will train the system to be rewarded for certain things, and that in and of itself is bias. It's just whether we think those biases are fair or not. I think a good example of this is where, I can't remember, I think maybe it's MSN is giving over their homepage to an AI algorithm that's going to show you stories based on what's popular today and what they think is relevant. But there's so many questions about journalistic integrity and getting a variety of information, and that self-selection of only seeing the things you want to see. And is that actually the right outcome for a society, for people just to be given what they want to know? Shouldn't people actually be given some of the stuff that they don't want to know about? And I think that's where we need to really look at those use cases. And in some cases, it's probably not going to be a good candidate for AI, and you still just need humans to do it.
Okay. Well, any last words?
Oh yeah, I'd just add to that and just say, I think it comes back to those governance principles. Governments are, elected by us, so they represent the wisdom of the crowd, so to speak. They're supposed to. So, really driving and advocating for the transparency, the accountability and the objectivity externally, whether it's through regulation, independent audit, or the companies themselves in self-regulating that aspect, I think is really important.
An excellent point, Sarah, because a lot of this today is being driven, as you said, by the FANGs, which are private company or public companies, but they're companies, they're not governments. And so there is definitely a role to be played there to represent the constituency.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for your excellent presentations and answering all these questions in such an interesting way. This is again where we thank you as the speakers, and we say you can talk to them at drinks afterwards. We're going to have that virtually. I also want to thank KPMG for partnering with the UK Business School on this thought leadership webinar. If this webinar sparked your interest in furthering your education, we encourage you to look into our postgraduate programs and executive education professional development short courses. Our programs and courses are designed to challenge you and help you develop the leadership skills, insight, and confidence to innovate, adapt, and face emerging business challenges head on, like the challenges that we've been discussing here today in this webinar. Applications for our #1 ranked ABA program close this month on the end of June, so on the 30th of June, while applications for our fully online Master in Leadership and Service Innovation program close on the 31st of July. Thank you very much. Thank you to the speakers. Please take care. We look forward to connecting with you again very soon. Thank you.